Okay, good. Well, we're coming to the close of the first day here, and we've got the reporters and discussants for the various breakout groups that we had. And so again, I'm Tom Fisher here moderating, and we have our morning group here. We have Maren Day and Mitai Kim and Alan Schur. And then we have our afternoon group here, which is Jennifer Swift, Galen Newman, and Brian Deal. And I thought the best thing to do, I thought I'd start with Alan and Jennifer. And then what we have a handheld mic, so I'm going to be the mic passer. I'll be the runner here. To really get from all of you the sense of the conversations from the breakout groups that you were in. And as I think we all know at this point, this first day we were really trying to assess both the 8+2 categories, how they worked for everyone, what might change, as well as the conversations we just had around the Sustainable Development Goals. And the purpose of the discussions was really to help us think about what we can do differently, better next time around. And if the discussions in the group I was in are any indication, there were a lot of really terrific ideas. So I think that my hope is that we can see, are there some commonalities among the conversations that were going on? And maybe we could end by 5:30 today with some maybe specific recommendations that you all think are worth pursuing. Sound like a plan? Good. Okay, well, Alan, why don't I start with you? Some thoughts?
Sure, thank you. And am I on? Yes.
Yeah.
I think, as with Jennifer, I want to thank the group that was in the room with me for lots of good conversation. It was actually, this is now the second IGC meeting. We have different questions, and I think in the positive way that everyone hoped, the level of conversation keeps getting more refined in a very productive way. So thanks to everyone for that. So we were tasked to begin to think about some sort of almost preliminary basics about going into a problem. How useful were the global assumptions and innovations? I think everyone was generally happy with the assumptions. There was some wordsmithing to some degree, but the 12 general factors were important. There is a question, though, to what degree are those 12 conditions independent contexts or actually interdependent? And how do we begin to think about how they relate to each other? Because they will be interdependent in different ways in different places. And beginning to understand that might be a step forward. On the innovations, this was a slightly different condition. Yes, they were generally successful. However, there are some questions about how innovative are we really being? Some of the innovations are actually almost routine now, or at least everyone sort of accepts that they're there. Others may be a little farther out there, but we may need to think about sort of providing a spectrum from present but not evenly distributed across the globe to much more science fiction. And each team would then have to figure out what its level of tolerance is or acceptability is for going forward with new technologies. Now we were importantly asked who does that and how, and I think our group was on firm ground that this needs to be crowdsourced. That across IGC members. There has to be somebody to compile them, but there are too many good ideas out in the world, and scanning technologies is a big job. So that needs to be a shared effort. And I think also we may think about, I know this is a topic for another group in more depth, but what's the scale of a technology? Is it a technology that works at a house, at a district, at a region? Those are things that our current definitions don't hold on to quite so well. The systems of, we went from a 9+1 to an 8+2. In general, I think people were happy with the systems. There was the expected, it would be really great if we'd had a little more freedom from an 8+2 to maybe a 6+4. Yeah. That said, when we looked at the individual systems for a large project, the group actually gravitated quite quickly to actually a 4+1. Where you would have a more complex system. You'd have a blue-green system, which would include agriculture. You'd have an energy system, a transport system, and a built system, which would include residential, commercial, industrial, going on the idea that it's going towards mixed use in many parts of the globe, and how do we do that? Which would leave one open for 5. We also had another point of view, though, which to adopt a system used in Europe, where you have an artificially modified system, which is everything that's built, an ag system, a forest system, a water body system, and a wetland system. And it's possible that either of those could work. In some ways, the European system might work best at a sort of a genuinely regional scale. It's not a metro scale.
Right.
So that's up to the conversation. We then, though, got a little bit, I'll say, not bogged down, but trouble defining below that what will be the most effective systems at a medium or small scale project. So we simply moved on. We did spend a lot of time discussing what might metrics be for the SDG matrix. And here, I would say we also didn't get as far as we should, just because it was hard. And part of that was knowing that actually, part of that was revealed in our second session when we understood that everyone used the SDGs differently. And so in some ways, there's a question of use to understand the metrics.
Right.
But I think that's an overall of how we did.
Good. Yeah. And then speaking of SDGs, Jennifer, do you want to summarize what you heard?
Well, there was a very long and interesting conversation about the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the first question, looking at how did they, if they directly related to land use or indirectly or some and very little, I think everyone found that the addition of the Sustainable Development Goals really helped them focus and find new innovations and realize that they could be doing more compared to the existing innovations. And in particular, we talked about targets and indicators as are those actually, is it feasible to measure those? Because if you go into each of the SDGs, they have quantifiable indicators. But is that feasible at a local scale or a global scale? If we look at monitoring even one particular goal, who's going to maintain that over time? There was a long discussion about was the scale approach useful? And most everybody liked that scale approach. They liked the matrix, and there was a very wonderful discussion about what's the next step with the how do we visualize that? Is there a better way to visualize that? There was an idea to visualize it geographically, instead of as a matrix. Maybe 3D graphics might be a nice way to a nice thing to approach next, and that should be another slide, an additional thing to add to the end, for example, of everybody's presentation.
In every poster, you mean?
In every poster. But there was quite a bit of concern about, are these real measures? What are we actually comparing? Is it real? Is it real? And it becomes very difficult to compare. Like, how are we doing the comparisons from project to project?
Good.
So the final thought was that the value in IGC and the Sustainable Development Goals in the comparisons is being able to look at all the different methods that people use and being able to see it in the same colors in the same ways and across the globe.
Right, for comparison, right? Good, thank you. Thank you both. Well, let's open it to the other discussants here. Miriam and Mintai, who wants to go first? Yeah.
Well, I'm Miriam Day. So starting with how useful were global assumptions in innovations, a lot of us actually said global assumptions are very helpful to guide their projects. However, we had a very critical view of innovations. Many of them said that innovations are not applicable to their projects, so they need to actually update them reflecting project conditions. So project by project could be different. format-wise, current systems are human-centric or land planning focused. So some people in our group kind of concerned about human-centric point of view and wanted to actually have non-human-centric factor, which is ecological factors or cultural factors and things. So it would be good to have layers of those. How and by whom, many said develop innovations and define them within the systems by conductors and participants, and that's what most of us agreed. Going to next question B. Instead of we looking at systems, so maybe our group agreed current systems are pretty good, but because it is a comparison with sustainable development goals, a lot of actually talks about sustainable development goals. Many said the goals are broad and somewhat unclear, and they require interpretations of goals and impacts to be measurable. Need to be clearly define each category. It is difficult to relate different scale to goals and need to be clear how to be used. And some of the ideas was stack goals in different ways, in like a pyramid kind of format type thing. So we can understand them better in the context of SDGs. Key points from that discussion was definition and interpretation process of a project is necessary for evaluation and comparison. Third item, identify 5 systems for large, medium, 10 for medium, and 20 for small scale projects. So first, we could not really identify 5 best systems, but because of that, we kind of, okay, how many systems did you use if you're large scale projects? So many got water infrastructure, agriculture, green energy, residential, mixed use residential, and flexible reflecting local conditions. However, some of them said agriculture actually needs to be somewhat redefined or addressed, modified, including food security, because agriculture and food security are related, but food security is beyond just agriculture for some perspective. Also, green infrastructure needs to be better definition, because some of them actually include ecological factors, which is non-human centric factors within green infrastructure. We didn't have anybody in middle-size projects done, so we skipped that one. For the small size, one group actually created and used subcategories of systems and generated up to 40 different systems to do a small-size system. But then that group said if they go back and redo, they would actually do approximately 15 to 18 systems focusing on water, green infrastructure, and energy infrastructure, and more toward their project related. That was the third. Lastly, so how might we develop metrics that lead to being able to complete the SDG metrics? Many metrics with actionable categories are not there for the SDGs, so we need subcategories with specific measurable goals. And then again, geographic representation with a 3D application will help to actually do that. Some of them said that some of the goals may not be applicable or representational with a geographical reference. So that was one. And another point was we should actually run simulation to measure the goals And then other point was it is a difficult to develop algorithm to measure the goals, actually to run the simulation. So that was, and lastly, we have comments from some people that SDGs are unclear and not actionable, so forget about SDGs.
Aha, there you go. On that note, Mintai?
Okay, so I'm not gonna kind of elaborate every discussion that we had, but I want to make a few observations. First of all, the same discussion sessions last year, I wasn't fully into it. I probably didn't have better understanding of this process, and this year I was more engaged. And one of the reasons I think why that happened was that I saw. Although I wasn't fully engaged in discussion last year, I saw that a lot of what we discussed was implemented in this year's version of IGC. And so we have more talking point.
Yeah,
Yes.
we listen.
Right. So that was great. And then I'm very hopeful. I was engaged because I'm very hopeful what I talked about, what we discussed this year is going to be implemented next year, and that will improve the process better. So we didn't have any really hard, feasible, tangible product out of discussion. We had very lively discussion. But just a few things about different things that were asked. I think the people in our session were generally happy that it's not 9 and plus 1, but 8 and 2 is flexible enough. There wasn't any major issues about the numbers not, helping them in their projects. So that was helpful. I think they were agreeing. One topic, one system that was raised as problematic was equity, social issues, and history issues. That's not really reflected there very well. So maybe that there can be another fixed one, and something else can be removed. Another system that was talked about was housing, and that I thought was a little problematic last year as version of IGC. This year we have one housing, and that's mixed housing, mixed residential, and that people found that was problematic. And we also found that some systems like water are simplistic, but housing could be different in different situations and in different scales. And so in Asia, low density is like 2-3 story housing unit. Here in this country, low density is like 8 units per acre or something like that. It's different. It's scale dependent, situation different, culturally dependent, and so forth. And another thing about scale, one person tried to do a large scale project and found that she couldn't achieve all 10 evaluation systems. So she rather chose, pursuing these 10 systems, she chose to eliminate the number of cases that she was going to work so that she could achieve 10 system evaluation. So that was interesting to find because it was limiting 10 systems, requiring 10 systems for all of the projects was. So the prompt that I was given is maybe 5 systems might be appropriate for very large scale things, and but that was one way of solution. But another way of solution was just making it smaller. So,
interesting.
Yeah, that was interesting. And what else? I think I'm going to stop there for now.
Enough. Yeah, good. All right. Okay. Let's see. Galen and then Brian.
All right. Thank you. So I was lead discussant on this sustainable development goals, just to FYI. But we had a long discussion about really how people utilize them. In other words, where they're using them to create initial goals for the project, or were they just forcing them in at the end after they did a project, right? So do the whole project, then come back and then do the Likert or Likert. We also had a discussion on Likert versus Likert enunciation. But I can say it either way. I'm from Alabama, so we talk weird anyway. So, but it was interesting to see. I mean, there were hybrid versions, of course, that some people used the initial goals to drive the project. A lot just did a project based on whatever the client wanted and then came back and tried to tuck it in. And then some people tried to go back and forth and use them to inform initially and then came back and then tried to adjust accordingly. So it was an interesting, I don't think there's a right or wrong, there's probably a righter or wronger method to do it. But overall, we actually had a vote. And so we had only one person that voted that they thought that the Sustainable Development Goals were unsuccessful. We had, I think, 7 that said successful, and then 6 were in the middle. So I guess that's promising. But overall, when we asked, okay, what were the other models that you want to use, there was no clear consensus, right? There were a couple of models provided, Texas-based models. Good job. But no one. But I think for the most part, as we talk more and more about how it's validated, these SDGs are validated, they're global, those kind of things. I think there was more buy-in as the discussion went on. And then we talked about the specifics of each sustainable development goal, and we asked which ones do you think should we even throw one out? That was something I pitched just to break the mold. Then I got a lot of blowback. No, we can't. It'll destroy the framework, that kind of stuff. But there was one, the sustainable cities and communities, right? That was the most famous one of all. Everyone tried to utilize that in their outputs, which makes sense, right? Because that's almost every project is trying to create that. And a lot of the SDGs are almost like objectives trying to achieve that. So there was a discussion on what happens if we take that out. But ultimately, I think majority were in favor of the way the SDGs as is. And there wasn't kind of a suggested matrix or template or framework that to substitute it either. But there was a discussion. I think some good points that maybe some merited further kind of clarity and digging into the actual, I forget how many bullet points, there are 129 of bullet points underneath the 17 SDGs, and maybe exposing some of those for a little bit more clarity, so maybe sustainable cities and communities isn't as ambiguous as we were making it. And that part of that's probably our fault for not digging in more as well. And then lastly, on the last question, we were talking about the Likert scale approach. Was it a good approach? And I think there were some positives and negatives. I think there was a discussion on were we creating valid research or arbitrary data based on what your assumptions were. But I think there was a great comment on if we want to make that more valid, how do we increase intercoder reliability for people doing the project? So maybe 3 to 5 people fill out the impact form, and then you check the intercoder reliability against each other, and if it's high enough, then you get something more valid. I think that's an interesting approach. And then the other option was, of course, how do we create ranges from actual numeric or quantitative outputs, and say, okay, if it's 70% lower poverty, then you get a 5 or something like that. But ultimately, I think that would be, I think that probably is a great approach. I'm not sure that everyone would have the capabilities to run different performance models. It would take a lot more workshops and those kind of things. So simplicity-wise, it would be a lot more complex. And then we also talked about what if we just use percent change in areas, so that if you stick to percent, then someone working at a large scale or a small scale, you could still be directly comparable because you're not using square footage or square miles. So if we stick to percentages and just areas of different land uses or whatever the outputs are on each adopter scenario, that might be a simplistic way to blend some of the qualitative stuff in with quantitative measures. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good point. And actually, as I was watching these talks today, I was wishing that we all had at least bar charts of land uses underneath these maps. Would have been. That's very easy. Yeah.
Good, Callan. Yeah. Right.
Well, we had a good group, a big, long range of topics around the SDGs came up. And I'm not going to be able to represent all of them. But we had similar conversations about the value of the goals, the validity of the goals. I think we all agreed there wasn't anything better. These have been vetted pretty thoroughly worldwide, so they were a good place to start as an umbrella. And the fact that it might be up to the individual project to define their role in each one of those, if at all, how they see it and how they define it and how they're measuring it. We had similar conversations about being able to quantify the measures, and maybe at the end of our conversations we started to talk about potential for tools that would be common tools that we all might use to do some of this quantification. There's concern, of course, about expertise and level of expertise needed to run some of these, but I think that's a pretty good idea, having some suite of tools that are usable, that can produce these simple histograms and other common metrics pretty simply in a straightforward way. We did talk about the Likert scale and those things, but wasn't really any consensus on anything better or a better way to do it. I think everybody appreciates the color scheme and the ability to see what's going on in a project really quickly. So the matrix is valuable for comparison purposes and to see the main components of a project really quickly and easily. Like I said, I'm not going to be able to talk about everything we hit, but we did think that the system is usable and workable, and some in the group actually want more detail and more regulation kind of, here's what we should do and here's the things to do, and some would like less, meaning the broad categories are fine and working within those broad categories is useful. So it was a broad range of opinions on those things.
Good, thank you. Well, it seems one theme that came out of both morning and afternoon conversations was greater clarity. And how might we go about that? I mean, I think that certainly we're open to that idea of, sort of definitional clarity about what it is we have in mind. Is it something that Carl and Brian and I just sort of do and put it out there? Or how can we is there some process whereby as we develop this, we get your input, we get feedback, we do some iterations? Any thoughts about that, Mintai?
So we talked about a clarity about SDG, right?
Right.
The better thing for us to have from the three of you will be actually what those SDG mean for all of us, instead of making us to go to UNDP site and read a lot about it. If there is some definition what they mean, that will be helpful for us. Not only helpful, but that kind of will unify the product a little better, to give a consistency.
Sure.
And so that's answer for that. And
Yeah.
I missed one comment earlier. I told you that this workshop, discussion sessions are great to improve the IGC process, but a lot of these questions that were given to us as prompt for these discussions could be incorporated into the reporting format. So we are required to follow this template process and all that, but if that is not as a report, but to present to the public, but rather to improve the process, if we are asked, the participants are asked to, talk about how they evaluated things and that, and all of this, whether the 10 systems worked for them or not, and what system could be included in that, rather than waiting for IGC to happen, that could be, intermediate report, or that could be part of a report for next year, so that we would know whether, by the time we gather like this next year, we would know what would work and what might not work.
Real-time evaluation.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So we are good at now following what is required, right? So we are doing this for the last 2 years, and just adding a little bit more will help us improve this process a lot better and more efficiently.
Sure. Good. Alan, and then.
So this will, I think what I'm going to suggest takes more than the triumvirate.
Right.
But I think we had several conversations across our groups today about direct and indirect effects of design. And the ability to have a direct effect is a function of who's on your team. If you have an ag economist, you can do things directly as opposed to indirectly. So it may be a matter of having I'm just going to call it a provisional concept mapping of how the SDGs relate to one another. So that if you know you can have a direct effect because you've got the ag economist, well, have at it.
Right.
But if not, there may be a second or third order effect that comes about by the way you make county roads to begin to do that. That is a big activity, but I think would actually help. I think in part, this has already happened in some of the groups because the original matrix that was sent out identified 12 of the SDGs as somehow actionable through geodesign. But some of the teams actually added those blank ones into their major impacts anyway. So 5 teams mentioned quality of education as being impacted. 3 teams mentioned reduced inequality as impact. 2 teams mentioned gender equality as impact.
Right.
Peace and justice, strong institutions were not mentioned, and partnerships to achieve goals not mentioned. But somehow in the background mental calculus of some of those teams, they were already there.
Right.
I think we just need to flesh that out to provide some level of initial guidance. And if someone wants to change a cause and effect, then that's what they do.
Yeah, a lot of conversations around equity and panels. Let's see, Galen?
Yeah, I mean, I think, other than simply defining the SDGs, which I think for further clarity is definitely needed, I think it's also important that you deflect the responsibility to the people doing the work to actually force them to understand how. And one of the reasons why I say that is that one of the discussions we had was, even in these talks while we're here, everyone just says, okay, here's the icons are the ones that the Likert scale showed that are the most popular. But we don't see any sort of connection back to the original goals of the project and I was thinking maybe that could be where the performance metrics or quantification comes in. So if you have the top 5 based on the Likert scale and your top 1 is, related to sea level, right? You can put any metric you want and say, I protected, 10,000 people from being flooded by 2050 or something. That could be a way that you build in performance modeling quantification that's flexible, right? And it allows anyone to use whatever model that they want, but it's linked to the SDG goals that are built into the framework. So it also will deflect the responsibility. Okay, here's the definition, and then here's the Likert scale ranking system, right? And then here's a quantified measure proving that this actually occurred. To me, that provides some flexibility, and it allows anyone that wants to quantify things according to different performance models the ability to do so, but it's targeted around specific SDG goals.
Right, and they have to demonstrate that they did it, yeah. One of the other things, Jennifer, did you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say there was a wonderful comment about how the Sustainable Development Goals take us out of our comfort zone.
Yeah.
And that I think all of the goals, everyone identified with, but the ones that we identified with most are our comfort zones. How we're experienced and what we're educated, and then we're looking around at those again, at the ones that we've never considered before and saying, hey, I'm addressing that too.
Yeah, we talked about them being kind of prompts to get us to think differently about our work. One of the other ideas that came in our group was this notion that we input information in a searchable, sortable database so that it isn't just a matrix on a poster, but we could be basically having that sorting capability right from the beginning. And Maren?
Yeah, there was an idea about a graphic. Do you want to talk about the graphic?
Yeah. Go ahead, Maren.
I was a note taker, but we had a graphic idea about kind of a center empty, but then starting with a SDG model, few, 5 or 6 of them, and then subcategories keep expanding and expanding. So, but then who would be in charge of a center there? And could it be one climate, I think was a planetary health, or climate action, or climate justice, and some others, but also idea of, Esri might be the center organizing all of that, something like that. And then that discussion expanded, okay, maybe not just a circular form, maybe spiral form, doing more expansion and looking at more in depth and kind of formulate different ways. Another actually note that following on about the SDG model, so some discussions came out, I'm just looking at the photo I took, is that some suggested indicators and targets could come first before even global assumptions, and actually having the set goals and then identify global assumptions, and each project conductors or participants identify innovations, and then we start working through, and then that creates kind of, and then evaluate them, and going back to loop, and the whole feedback process might be one way to evaluate as well.
Right, that came up. Brent made that point. Start with the goals and then work to the systems rather than going the other way around. Yeah.
Rather than indicators, so we talked about this SDG being the beginning of the process and start from there. And so incorporating that idea right in the beginning rather than using it at the end. And somewhat related to that, we thought that the matrix, of SDG and the 10 systems is a way of presenting the impact model. So this was not done last time, but this time, it forced us really to do an impact model. So this was good, and there were a lot of discussions about that 3-point scale, being somewhat problematic, But this was a really good beginning that we can jump from here to make it really just not preliminary impact model, but make it a little more substantial.
Yeah.
So actually on that, the process actually might have them at the beginning, but it depends how you define the beginning. Because if you look at Carl's framework, there are 3 passes. And the first pass is just, what do you got? And you get to that bottom of the first part and you're saying, what do the decision makers actually need to decide to do something? That's when the indicators actually get defined. And so it is at the beginning, if you define the beginning as the beginning of the second pass. And then they're there. So I think that they are, but that assumes that everyone going through this process actually has the luxury or the time, and also the students, to go through all 3 passes. If you did this with high school students or freshmen, you might not go through all 3 because you might actually, as the instructor, structure everything. So you've structured the first pass by yourself and you begin that in. So it's a little more complicated, but I certainly understand if we don't have those indicators baked in somewhere earlier on, it doesn't work.
Yeah, Galen, did you, or Brian? Yeah, go ahead.
I want to go back to your original comment about this this forum of these different tools. I think it would be good, just in going back to Carl's talk on a histogram of just areas. Most of the performance tools that will be used in impact and decision models, they're all just area-based. You input a zip code and different areas of green infrastructure or land use areas, and they run black boxes, right? And they spit out metrics at the end. And I know, just off the top of my head, the LAF, the Landscape Architecture Foundation's Benefits Toolkit has a collection of some. There's the Coastal Resilience Toolkits. There's the LTHEA model that my students showed today. There's one called Costing Nature. There's the Geodesign Hub. To me, it would be appropriate to gather all of these tools, at least if just in one. If I can go to the Esri site and click on this thing, and there's just a compilation of all these web links I can play with. So, and all of them kind of focused around certain elements, whether it be green infrastructure, whether it be sea level rise, any of the things that we're dealing with as focused problems in regards to geodesign projects, and just having that outlet. I'm not saying that you need one person from Esri to give workshops of every one of these, but a lot of them are, if you can do a histogram, all you have to do is input numbers, and whether or not they're all valid is another approach. But that's where we are right now in kind of landscape performance anyways. So being able to use and test and validate these models is what's needed, and enough people aren't doing it, and I think it's a great bridge from, geodesign encourages that. You have to do it to assess what you're doing if it solved the problem. So having, one, awareness of those outlets, but two, being able to utilize, some of those tools is I think necessary moving forward.
Yeah.
And of digging and applying them to this
Right.
approach.
Speaking of tools, so Jennifer, you mentioned the 3D issue, and some others have mentioned that as well. How would you envision that being integrated into this process?
Oh, we got really excited talking about that.
Yeah.
There was some wonderful ideas about how this would show the interconnection between all of the different global development goals, because they're all interconnected.
Right.
And that was a great way to show, and it would grow and develop as projects grow and develop. It would change the 3D graphic.
So you weren't thinking necessarily about a 3D representation of a landscape, but actually 3D representation of the relationships of the SDGs.
Yeah,
it's an intellectual kind of.
That's the second one. The first one was a geographic representation
Right.
of the basic of what we did
Right.
this time.
Yeah, interesting. Mira, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I can add that part. So we found the metrics are somewhat representational, quantifying, numbers so we can compare things. But we felt that that's not enough, especially kind of identifying some of the relationships, especially geographical relationships. So to make that happen, we thought that geospatial reference is an important part of the assessment. So somehow indicating geospatial reference within the metrics would help to find especially relationships between different systems and
Right.
things like that. Also, some argue that, some systems may not be measurable or identifiable in geographic locations, and that isn't something that we need to actually kind of further discuss and do more about it. But instead of those cases, instead of identifying dots or area, could it be just zones or districts and things? And then that's where we actually come up with, we need to extrude to actually show the assessment of the area or bigger district or systems and sort. So that's why we came up with 3D model with a geographical representation would be.
Yeah, interesting. Good. Alan, you were talking in your group about you got it down to 5, which congratulations.
4 plus 1.
4 plus 1, yeah, that's even better. Yeah, and in the group I was in, we were also talking about is there a temporal scale issue depending on the size of the project? That small size projects actually happen at such a rapid pace that it's all done by 2035. You don't even have a 2050 time horizon. So, what are the differences of scale, and what difference does that make?
We touched on that a little bit also with a question of do small projects happen faster, medium, and slow, which is often the case, maybe not always the case.
Right.
So I think that was part of it. But also coming back to the SDGs, each of those actually operates at a different spatial and temporal scale also. And it could be that when specifying a project, that scale choice, that spatial scale choice actually drives the SDGs that you most focus on, which also then may define the team you need for it.
Right.
So I think in some ways that the question of scale, in the same way, much the way the question of value came up a lot last time,
Right.
I think this question of scale is the big question that we're trying to wrestle with now, which I think is a
Right.
productive step. opens up a very thorny set of issues. But being faced with that now in terms of scale and decision making does advance the overall agenda of the IGC. And so I think that's important. I wish I had a simple answer for you other than no, we've actually hit it on several, it's come across in several different conversations now, which means it actually has risen to the level where we actually have to do some level of clarification for the participants and then perhaps also then instruction for the participants.
Right.
I'll leave the instruction part to the triumvirate. Okay.
All right, good. I should also just welcome any questions or thoughts. Brian, here, I'm going to be the runner here. Go ahead.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, there's two things. I'll start off with one, which, maybe we can re-inject this into the discussion at some time. When we were talking about adopting the SDGs as both goals and also measures of performance, I did look through the SDGs and I looked through all of the sub-buttons or whatever to investigate them. And one of the things that's a challenge with them is that they do not have spatial components to them. They do not have land use issues. So one of the challenges is to tie the kinds of things we do, which is think about land use allocations, tie those to the SDGs. And that if we apply some kind of thinking to that over the next short period of time, that could be useful in all kinds of arenas. So that's one point. Sorry, let me do two more. Second one is, my notes. Actually, one point on the two issues. We talked about visualizations, how to handle this information that we've got, whatever it is. And the other was, Galen was talking about, there are lots of models, lots of metrics available. One thing that, I think we should do as an immediate thing is to take the kinds of issues that you're talking about in crude form as crude white papers and get them onto the IGC website so they can be used immediately by all of us. Because the last meeting we had, we talked about these things, but we didn't capture them and use them. It would be, it would be great if we could make a commitment to do that. We don't have to wait for the book. Let's not do that, but let's get these out. So if just practical example, if I got a Word file or something like that with hot links in it and documents, that'll go on the website as soon as I can get it on. So it'll be available.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I mean,
Galen, go ahead.
I could put together a Word file with hot links for all the ones I know for you in 3 minutes. If that's what you. Yeah, but it would be. My point is, it would be great to reach out to everyone.
But when we started at IGC, we attempted to do that. A lot of talk about systems and gathering the innovation. We really, as a group, we did not perform very well. It's really, you only need to look at the posters in the cafeteria to see that the innovations, not only are they, they're scattered, and some of them are downright poor. If we could do a better job this time, that would be enormously helpful.
Right. Carl?
My perspective is on the one hand more radical, on the other hand more conservative. Let me be quite clear. I worry about a very important objective, and that is getting more schools involved globally. And the balance between what we enable and what we require, which I consider different things. And I think Einstein is right. We should be as simple as possible, but not more so. And that we should enable things broader, but we should be very cautious about what we require from everybody, because we have beginners and we have very sophisticated users. For example, let me give an example. I think requiring a histogram of land use is very easy because everybody has it as a byproduct of what we have already done, and that is a digital land use map. It automatically comes out with one button on any piece of software that you use. However, I remember a discussion with Brian and Tom half a year ago, and the question was, we know of groups. We've talked to them. about groups that are now automating SDG assessments from land use plans. And the question is this: are we ready on November 1st to send all of our files to one organization that will comparatively present all of the SDGs at a cost? Or are we going to get a list of SDG evaluation assessments, and you might pick 1, 2, 3, you might pick 4, 5, 6, you might pick none, and you might pick 9 of them. And we're not comparable anymore. But we've enabled everybody who wants to make measures to make measures. I'm perfectly comfortable with that, but I'm not comfortable with listing a bunch of programs, which I've gone through this many times in my career, but you use a set and he uses a different set, and then we're not comparable. So I'd love to enable more, but I'm not sure I want to require it. Right. The second thing has to do with which comes first, the design or the assessment model. If we're going to be dealing with classification systems definitions, do we define as IGC what we want for our designs and then tell the model makers to change their classification of inputs? Or do we find the models that do the assessment work, take their input definitions, and make our designs so they fit into their models? That's a real decision. And that, by the way, is likely to be next year's decision when these models become public. From my perspective, I don't know how to answer that question. My third comment is this: if you take this from the student's perspective and not the quality of scientifically validated models perspective, I can recall when I was working with Taj at the Ljubljana project, we had 3 students making every judgment on these matrices. And they would discuss, is this a 3 or a 2? Oh, this is 3 or 1. They came up with their decision, 3 students. That was the first time that those students have been asked to evaluate anybody's work, ever. And they had a framework. They did it in 2 hours, and that was one hell of an educational experience. Now, would that have been made better by having numbers that they don't understand, as opposed to adjectives which they were able to talk about? Now, I'm willing to bet that our Abu Dhabi students or our Singapore students would define those systems differently and locally, but they'd go through the same exercise. And maybe that's the most important thing. So I can remember being part of a discussion in the Clinton administration on how do we build an index of biological health for America. And the outcome of that was every index is arbitrary. You tell me what the outcome is, I can tell you what the index should be. I can gerrymander it. So we need to be careful when we talk about secondary impacts and how we measure them, because they get confused and nobody will understand them. And if they don't understand them, they won't do it. But if we're simple and we communicate, they might say, tell me more. And at that point, we do more. So these are the decisions that we really have to go through. And having the sense of us as to where those are, as long as we can distinguish what's required versus what's enabled, we can do both. But if we confuse required with enabled, we're going to cause hell and confusion among the member schools that are trying to do the work. It's a very important point. The advice is good, but let's make the distinction among your discussion. What would you require versus what would you enable?
Thoughts?
Yeah, I guess my vision when I was speaking of, putting these performance models, I think my idea was that it would supplement the Likert scale. Right. Yeah, so the idea would be that whatever your top 5 or whatever SDG goals you hit, you then try to quantify some sort of quantification to prove that happened. I mean, so it wouldn't be required per se. It would just supplant. It would supplement, exactly. Yeah.
Others? Anyone else want to respond to Carl Bryan?
One idea that came up in our group was to instead of having the entire list, to narrow it down for the year, to say, okay, these are the 5 things that we're going to focus on this year, so that it would enable more people to, participate, but focus their efforts. So it would require us to, know which ones we were going to focus on, but it might enable broader participation and better comparisons across, because now everyone's not doing so diffuse work or focusing on these 3 issues. That might be a thing. Maybe there's a different set of issues every year, depending on what's going on globally, that could help with the specificity, and it might help with the kinds of models that could supplement the work.
Alan, right to you.
So I think this is picking up from one of our conversations, I think the afternoon conversation in our group. Peter from RISD had mentioned, what are we actually trying to compare, and are we getting there with the right tools? I took the opportunity to over-intellectualize it and said that we're probably, in our quest for the instructions, asking for greater precision than we can accurately compare. And on the one hand, I also said that I'm not sure that's bad at this point, because we're not quite sure we're trying to still gauge our measurements. But I think I would, if I could add a requirement, it would be a cross-impact table of cause and effects. And it could be the SDGs and how they relate. It could be the global assumptions. But I think if the groups, the beginning students, could simply say, there's this thing and it has a positive or an exacerbating or mitigating effect on that thing, that level of conversation, I think then that perhaps going to the Likert, I'm on the Likert side, by the way, assessment has more meaning as an educational experience, and also for us as a comparative experience in terms of us comparing the schemes. So if I could add that requirement, I would add that requirement. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it would be it's a cross-impact table, so it's not a complicated template.
Okay. Before Jorge, go ahead, and then Carl.
Shall I, or will Carl reply? No, okay. Carl, I would like to refer back to the SDG, because I mean, there seems to be a problem with the SDGs in a certain way, that the room full of intelligent people that I was sitting in as well, I mean, we have a certain problem to maybe understand why they are coming into your framework and into the system. I try to. I'm much more direct than the American colleagues at the podium are. So I try to be as careful as I can be in any way. But there seems to be a problem that we don't understand, or there are a lot of people here who don't understand. Is this coming in as a kind of scale bar, as a tool for measurement and comparison, or where does it come from? Because if we look at some examples of the SDGs, yeah, I mean, very famous was today this kind of, if you put it short, no poverty, which is a big aim, big dream. So it might be a bad example, but there are others of these SDGs which we will maybe try, or we think we try to measure something like 1, 2, 3, or good or bad on this kind of scale. But how can we do that? This is what I think, which it should be explained. What do you really expect? Because there is no kind of really comparable way to measure these big things in relation to our projects. It seems not really perfectly fit. I'm maybe not, it's the best way I try to put it, but maybe you can explain, why are we fighting with this new dragon coming in now that we just got all the systems under control, that we successfully discussed the number, and we maybe walk towards something like globality? I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, Mike, can you get Carl? Thank you. Likert. Thank you, Brent. Thank you. Just saying.
Let me explain this, not as the person who made the decision, but as part of the group that did make the decision to do that. When we debriefed ourselves, when basically Brian and Tom and I debriefed ourselves from the first year's work, we had wanted to see some impact assessment that was comparable across the schemes. This was intentionally an impact recording system, not a goals setting system as we saw it. That's why it came at the end of the presentation, and why the assumptions and the innovations were at the top of the posters, and it was located at the bottom of the posters after the designs were presented. It was seen as an impact, a way of recording impact, and not using the word measuring, but using the word assessing, judging. All right? I've done lots of studies trying to measure, always unsuccessful. And I've done lots of studies judging, usually successful. And the idea that everything that has to be measured is a number, I reject. I personally reject. So my view was, in the absence of a better system, and given the fact that this has been adopted by 2/3 of the countries of the world as official policy, warts and all, let's try it, see what happens. If we want to, we talked about rejecting it if it doesn't work. But, as you've discussed, what's a better one? Now, maybe the answer to your comment is, let's let each team find those that they think they're solving or addressing, for better or worse, because some of the impacts are worse. And let's just see what they select as things that they think they're assessing, and ignore the ones that they're not assessing or don't understand. That's one of our options. We could do that. We could do all those kind of things. And we'll certainly discuss it. But it was not seen as the goals of the design. Originally, it was not. Several of us presented it that way, but that was not my view of it. We'll have to react. We'll have to react to that. There's lots of ways to react. I think it would be foolish to reject it for one important reason, as we'll talk about that tomorrow. And that is, this is in fact an official policy, warts and all, arbitrary as it is by definition, vague as it is by serious people, and having tried to do something in my life at least twice comparable to that, I think this is the best one we have. And it's worth giving it one more year and seeing what we can do to tweak it.
Does
Let me add one more comment. The more that our colleagues follow literally the templates and don't tweak them, the more we can do to make it deeper in terms of the things that we all do. Let me say that again in a very clear way. The more that you follow the templates that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to do, and not make us edit and change things, the more we can do to make the projects deeper in terms of their inputs, middle game, and outputs. Making it totally flexible so everybody can do whatever they want and call it geodesign violates totally the objectives of the collaboration, because it voids the idea of collaboration, let alone the means of collaboration. And that's a very tough balance to make. We've written about that in the book. We've talked about it many times. And what you want is the best things you can do. But you also want things that we can learn from each other. And if we end up ever doing something that's big with subparts, and they can't talk to each other in the same language, then we're in real trouble. And keeping those collaborative across scale, across time, and across culture and geography as an objective means that you have to give up some flexibilities. And that balance violates our individual, personal, cultural, university, academic freedom things, and especially as it affects our students. And that's a real issue. And it's a balancing game, which we do. And it's good to have individuals saying, this is what I want. But when you say yes, and we're all going to do that, that affects us all. And when we say, this is what we're going to do, all of us, that affects your freedom. And that's a tension. And that's a tension that we just have to wrestle with.
Good.
And the mode of work that Tom and Brian and I, when we make these decisions, is we make them, we change them. We make them, we change them. And at some point, the balance seems comfortable. And if you look at the summary comments in the book, read the last chapter, because we had one person writing a chapter say, this doesn't work. And we had another person say, it works pretty well for almost everybody. And that's actually the objective. Perfection is impossible. It's just not possible. But pretty well for almost everybody is damn good.
Untitled, did you want to?
Okay, our group never thought about actually rejecting SDG at all. I think that wasn't an issue at all. We kind of like it, and we want to possibly improve. The discussion was more about improving it and how to adopt it better. So there was no, I'm not sure about other groups, but at least our group, it wasn't that discussion. And the other is more people following the template. And it's good, but last year and a year, I was learning, but while teaching this thing. So it's kind of difficult when I am learning the requirements and template to enforce my students to do it. So if we can learn this collectively together, not just announcing it on a website, and we kind of have a session together and educate us what's really required early on before we engage in these projects, and that might help for us to follow the template better, what's required better.
Great. Well, it's 5:30 and we are at time. Tomorrow we'll have more lightning talks. We'll have more discussions around interdisciplinarity, connecting to students, curriculum. We're also going to love to hear your thoughts about the future of the IGC and how we can continue to grow this effort. So there's a lot more to talk about, and it's been a great first day, I think. So thank you, and let's thank our panelists here.